Chapter 16. One of the worst things that happened in that first week was that Mrs. Poindexter questioned Chad. After school on Wednesday, Chad didn't speak to me. He seemed to be avoiding me, and I had no idea why. He didn't say much at dinner either, but later, when Mom and Dad were watching TV, he came into my room, shut the door, and without sitting down or really looking at me, said that Mrs. Poindexter had called him into her office that morning. He said she'd asked him, in not very thinly veiled terms, about me and Annie and other girls, whether I had more girlfriends than boyfriends, if he'd ever seen me touching a girl, especially Annie, things like that. And still, without meeting my eyes, he told me he'd said no to all the questions about girls and, I don't know, to the ones about boys. In other words, he managed to do his best to save my skin without actually lying. Neither of us said much after that, but he did finally look at me, scared and hurt and embarrassed and full of questions, and I remember thinking, this is my little brother in front of me, the kid who's always trusted me, and I knew I couldn't lie to him the way I had to Mom and Dad. He said, "Liza, I'll go on saying the same things to Poindexter, but I saw you and Annie holding hands once, and you sure spent a lot of time with her at Miss Stevenson's and Miss Woodmere's house. Is it true?" So I said, yes, and then I tried to explain. After I finished, he was quiet a long time again, and then he asked, "Do you think you have to be like that?" Then it was my turn to be quiet, but after a minute, I said, "I think I am like that." Chad nodded sadly, but not in any kind of disparaging way, and then he hugged me and left. Later that night, I heard him crying in his room. And then there was Annie, the hurt I'd seen on her face. She never talked about it. I remember she cut school and came down to Brooklyn the afternoon of the day I saw Sally on the steps, not even calling first, because she was afraid I'd tell her not to come. Mom had gone to the store, and when I answered the door and saw Annie standing there, all I could do was cling to her, especially as soon as I saw her eyes and realized that the hurt was still there. I didn't want to think about what it had done to her to have Miss Baxter barrel up the stairs and find her the way she had, to have Sally and Miss Baxter stand there looking at her as if they thought she was a whore. "Liza, Liza," she said, stroking my hair, "are you okay?" "I think so," I said. "Annie, are you?" "No one knows for sure that I'm gay, except you and Miss Stevenson and Miss Woodmere," she said softly, touching my face. "I don't even count Sally and Miss Baxter. Nobody's doing anything to me. Maybe I should tell my parents. I just wish I could share this with you." "I'm glad you can't," I said, "and I'm glad you haven't told your parents. Liza, don't let it make any difference. It won't, will it? With us, I mean." "Of course it won't," I told her. But I was wrong. 6 months of not writing, that's a difference. And so I lied to Annie. On top of everything else, I lied to Annie, too. Friday afternoon, just about the time when the rally was supposed to be held at Foster, Mom practically dragged me out of the house to the Brooklyn Museum. I couldn't tell you a thing we saw. It wasn't so much that I cared about the rally anymore. I didn't, at least not very much. But I did care about my speech. Even though I'd have been nervous giving it, I'd worked on it with Annie, and so it was partly hers. "The speech was okay, Liza," Chad said, when Mom and I got home at about 6:30. "Sally wasn't as good as you'd have been, but it was okay. 2 newspaper people were there, and one of them said he thought it was a good speech. Should raise a lot of money," he told Mrs. Poindexter. "I don't think Sally changed it much, either." After I'd thanked him, I ran into my room and slammed the door. Saturday, I got a letter from Mrs. Poindexter telling me the trustees' hearing would be the following Tuesday evening, April 27th. Sometimes I think the trustee's hearing was worse than when Miss Baxter barged in. Sometimes I'm not sure. The parlor looked different that Tuesday night with the trustees in it, maybe because it was night. The hearing had to be then because most of the trustees had jobs during the day. The only people there I already knew were Mrs. Poindexter, Miss Baxter, and of course Miss Stevenson and Miss Woodmere. They had a lawyer with them, a tallish woman in a gray dress with a bird pin on the collar. I don't know why I noticed that pin, but I kept staring at it almost the whole time my parents and I, were waiting to go in. My parents didn't bring a lawyer. I think they were embarrassed to. Mom said she didn't think we needed one, because, after all, I hadn't done anything, had I? Dad just looked away when she said that. After the hearing, he said he'd get a lawyer if the trustees actually expelled me or decided to put anything on my record. I wanted to go over and talk to Miss Stevenson and Miss Woodmere while we were all waiting to go in, but Dad wouldn't let me. He apologized, but he said it wouldn't be a good idea. Both he and Mom smiled at Miss Stevenson and Miss Woodmere, though, and then we all hung around stiffly in the hall, waiting. Miss Stevenson and Miss Woodmere and their lawyer were sitting on the wooden settle. Mrs. Poindexter and Miss Baxter were already inside. The whole thing felt the way being caught in quicksand must feel when you know you're not going to be able to get out, especially if you struggle. I also felt as if I were watching my own dream. I was there at the hearing, but I also wasn't there. I said things, I heard what other people said, but as if from a great distance. The only thing that seemed truly real to me was the one thought that wouldn't let go in my mind. It's Annie and me, they're all sitting around here like cardboard people and judging. It's Annie and me. And what we did that they think is wrong, when you pare it all down, was fall in love. Steady, my father said, walking into the parlor between my mother and me when we were called. Miss Stevenson and Miss Woodmere started to follow us, but the woman who'd called my parents and me waved them back to their seats. I must have looked pretty meek, walking in there with my parents. I know I was more scared than I'd ever been in my life. Mom had made me wear a dress and had tried to get my hair to stay in place by making me use conditioner, which I'd never done before, so I didn't even smell like myself. At least my hair didn't. Miss Stevenson and Miss Woodmere were wearing dresses, too, but at least they did most of the time. Skirts, anyway. But it did occur to me that it was as if all three of us were trying to say, see, we're women. We wear dresses. Oh, God, how ridiculous. As I walked in, I touched Annie's ring for luck and tried to remember the words to Invictus. The first person I noticed was Miss Baxter. She was sitting there looking very solemn and proper and righteous, as if she'd just been canonized. She was near the end of one side of the same long table that everyone had sat around at the student council hearing. The trustees sat along both sides of the table, also looking very solemn but not quite so holy, and there was an empty chair for me opposite Miss Baxter, and chairs for Mom and Dad behind mine. I remembered Sally whispering last fall in the same room, "It's like court on TV," and this time it was even more like that. The Inquisition, Annie called it later. Mrs. Poindexter, with a yellow notepad, was sitting under Letitia Foster's portrait at the head of the table. Miss Baxter was sitting next to her, but on the side, at right angles to her. At the other end of the table, opposite Mrs. Poindexter, was a fat, silver-haired man with tight-fitting glasses that sort of sank into his face. His name, he told me, was Mr. Turner, and he was the head of the Board of Trustees. I know there was a Miss Foster, who was a distant relative of Letitia's. Miss Foster was very old and didn't say anything. I'm not sure she could even hear. There was a woman with reddish hair and a pale face, the youngest of them, I guess, even though she looked middle-aged. She was the only one who smiled at me when I walked in. Next to her was a man in a green corduroy sports jacket and a turtleneck. There were one or two others, but they faded into a blur. Then it began. Mr. Turner asked Miss Baxter to tell in her own words what she'd seen, and told me to listen carefully. She said something like, "Yes, of course, but oh dear, you do understand how difficult it is to talk about such things." And the red-haired woman said, sort of dryly, "As I remember, you were the one who lodged the original complaint with Mrs. Poindexter, which made me like her right away." Then, while Mrs. Poindexter put on her glasses and looked down at her notes, Miss Baxter with the lace handkerchiefs, Miss Baxter who always went around saying one should believe the best of everyone, Miss Baxter who said it takes all kinds and the Lord made us all, Miss Baxter gave this incredibly lurid account of what she'd seen. It was awful. It made us sound like monsters, not like two people in love. That was the worst thing. Another thing I'm never going to be able to forget, even though I want to. It was as if everyone were assuming that love had nothing to do with any of this, that it was just an indulgence of carnal appetites. I think Miss Baxter actually used those words. Miss Baxter also said I was half naked when I came to the door, and that Annie had scurried guiltily out of the bedroom, wearing nothing but a red and black shirt, her lumber jacket, which, of course, was as big on her as a coat. "What else did you see?" Mr. Turner asked. Mrs. Poindexter smiled at Miss Baxter over the tops of her glasses. "Well," said Miss Baxter, "of course I felt I had to conduct a search because of my long-standing suspicions about the two older women. It saddened me to do it, but of course I had no choice. I had no idea but what there might be other young persons of similar persuasion somewhere, so I went upstairs. I must say the place was a shambles." The shambles, I realized, was because of the umbrellas and saucepans, and part of me wanted to laugh at that absurd line, "persons of similar persuasion." It sounded like the equally absurd "persons of the Jewish persuasion." I am of the lesbian persuasion, but it wasn't funny. Even later, when I tried to tell Annie about it, it wasn't. "Miss Baxter, please confine your remarks to what you saw involving the two young women only," Mr. Turner said, which I thought was pretty fair. Mrs. Poindexter leaned over and whispered to Miss Baxter, pointing to something on her notepad. Miss Baxter stumbled a bit as she said, "Well, Liza, when she answered the door, seemed very flustered. She was clutching her shirt closed across her bosom, and it was clear she had nothing on underneath, and she was blushing. Then later she kept looking at the other girl. What was her name?" Mrs. Poindexter took her glasses off and looked right at me, and suddenly there wasn't a drop of saliva in my mouth. I'd already made a promise to myself not to mention Annie's name, on the grounds that the Board of Trustees had nothing to do with her. And Mom and Dad had both agreed with me. Dad leaned forward, but the red-haired woman said quickly, "The other girl doesn't concern us, since she's not a foster student." "Well," said Miss Baxter, "she kept looking at her, Liza did, and poor little Sally Gerald said something like, 'Oh, my God,' for which I certainly do not blame her. I mean, what a terrible shock it must have been, especially since she and Liza are friends, and since Sally is already deeply and maturely involved with a young man." "Miss Baxter," said Mr. Turner tiredly, "please confine yourself to what actually happened, not what you thought about it or thought someone else thought about it." Miss Baxter looked hurt. "Eliza ran to the stairs," she said, whining a little now, "and forcibly tried to keep me from going farther, which of course made me certain something else was going on." I almost leapt out of my chair, but Dad put his hand on my shoulder. "You'll get your turn, Liza," he whispered. "Stay loose." Miss Baxter went on, "But since of course I felt it was my duty to expose those women once and for all for what they are, of course at that point I only suspected, I went on and well, the rest does have more to do with the women than with the girls, though how one can call people like that women, I'm sure I don't know." Miss Baxter sat back, not smiling, but piously, as if she felt sure no one could possibly disagree with her. Mr. Turner looked disgusted, though, and the red-haired woman looked as if Miss Baxter was something she'd like to squash under her heel. Mrs. Poindexter was smiling nastily. I would like to add, she said, that I am grateful to Miss Baxter for having the courage to bring this entire appalling matter to my attention. I, of course, did not hesitate. The man in the corduroy jacket leaned forward, his pencil poised over a yellow pad. Miss Baxter, he said, ignoring Mrs. Poindexter, am I right in deducing that you were far more concerned all along about the women than about the girls? About confirming he consulted his pad, your long-standing suspicions about the two teachers? Mr. Turner looked a little uncomfortable, but he didn't say anything. I told you, said Miss Baxter, that I have been disturbed for years by my feeling that all is not as it should be between those women, that there is a sad, unnatural relationship between them. If two young girls, one of them a foster girl, were, well, being immoral, here I almost jumped up again, in their house, and if I actually saw one of them running half naked out of the bedroom, I could only assume that there were perhaps more young people, perhaps foster students, also using the house lewdly with, I had to believe, Miss Stevenson's and Miss Woodmere's sanction. I felt it my duty to clarify that point. Mrs. Poindexter nodded emphatically. The red-haired woman muttered something sardonically that sounded like a very orgy, but I'm not absolutely sure that's what she said. And when I did go upstairs, said Miss Baxter, I found the bed unquestionably mussed, and I did at the same time just happen to see the books I mentioned in the, complaint, horrible, obscene books. Miss Baxter, said the red-haired woman, did you actually see the two girls touch each other in a sexual way? Well, said Miss Baxter, they stood there holding hands while I said in a sexual way, in an overtly, unmistakably sexual way. Holding hands, especially under stress, doesn't seem to me to be particularly significant. Well, said Miss Baxter, glancing uncomfortably at Mrs. Poindexter. Well, in, that kind of way, overtly, perhaps not, but after all, it was plain as day what they had been up to. As I said, the bed was rumpled, and there were— I see, said the red-haired woman. Thank you. Any more questions for Miss Baxter? Asked Mr. Turner, looking around at the members of the board. I would just like to remind the board, said Mrs. Poindexter huffily, she had not once looked at me or my parents, that Miss Baxter has been in employ of this school for 10 years, and that her record is impeccable. Miss Stevenson and Miss Woodmere have both been at the school for 15 years, am I right? Asked the red-haired woman. Miss Stevenson and Miss Woodmere, said Miss Poindexter, especially Miss Stevenson, have become increasingly permissive as the years have passed. In fact, Miss Stevenson— Please, said Mr. Turner, we are not discussing the teachers now. Then he turned to me, and I guess the twitch at the corners of his mouth was his attempt at a reassuring smile. Eliza, he said, and I felt my stomach almost drop out. Unconquerable soul, I tried to say to myself, bloody but unbowed. And I touched Annie's ring again and took a deep breath to make myself calmer, but none of it really helped. Liza, rather, thank you for coming. I know this is going to be difficult for you and quite possibly embarrassing. I have to tell you, however, that we would prefer that you speak instead of your parents. Of course they may assist you, and if at any time the three of you feel you cannot proceed without counsel, we will adjourn until you can obtain same. I was a little confused, mostly because of being so nervous, and I guess Dad must have sensed it because he moved his chair next to mine and said, May I explain to my daughter, sir, that what you mean is that if she wants a lawyer, or we do, the hearing can be stopped until we get one? Mr. Turner did smile then and said, Certainly, Mr. Winthrop, and I thank you for doing so with such economy. I shall try to use, plainer language. Of course, then I felt like a dummy, which didn't help at all. Liza, said the red-haired woman, mostly we just like your version of what happened when Miss Baxter knocked at the door. Can you tell us? I didn't know what to say at first, so I licked my lips and cleared my throat and did all the things people do when they're stalling for time. I didn't want to lie anymore, but I didn't want to tell them everything either. But finally I realized she hadn't asked me about what had happened before Miss Baxter arrived, so I relaxed a little. I told them that it had been more or less the way Miss Baxter had said, except that she'd started to go upstairs before she'd seen Annie, and that I didn't think I had forcibly prevented her from doing that, although I had tried to stop her. But the more I talked, the more I realized it was obvious that I was leaving a lot out. And I also felt more and more that whatever I said wasn't going to make much difference anyway. It was what we were that Mrs. Poindexter and Miss Baxter were against as much as what we'd done. As soon as I realized that, I thought it was all over. "Liza," Mr. Turner said delicately, "Miss Baxter mentioned that you seemed, not quite dressed. Is that so?" "Well," I began. I could feel my face getting red. "Yes, sort of, but—" "What were you wearing, hun?" the red-haired woman asked. "A shirt and jeans," I said. "As Miss Baxter pointed out," said Mrs. Poindexter, "that was obviously all she was wearing." "Mrs. Poindexter," said Mr. Turner angrily, "this young woman let Miss Baxter speak without interruption. I think the least all of us can do is extend her the same courtesy." Mrs. Poindexter grunted, but unfortunately she'd made her point, and I could see the pencils scribbling. "And your friend?" asked the red-haired woman. "What was she wearing?" A lumberjacket," I stammered. "Is that all?" asked the man in corduroy. He sounded surprised. I felt my throat tighten, and I looked desperately around at my mother, who I think tried to smile at me. But oh God, that was worse. It was horrible, looking at her and seeing the pain on her face, seeing also that she was trying to be brave for my sake. I couldn't speak, so I nodded. I could feel my father squirm in his chair next to me, and I thought then that he must at that moment have realized I'd lied to him, even if Mom hadn't realized it, or wouldn't let herself. Mrs. Poindexter got up, walked to the other end of the table, and said something to Mr. Turner. He shook his head, and she said something else. Then the whole group of them, except Miss Baxter, who stayed put, started whispering. My mother glared at Miss Baxter, and my father reached out and took my hand. "Steady on," he whispered, even though I knew what he must be thinking and feeling. "Just remember that whatever happens, it's not going to be the end of the world." But then he and my mother looked at each other, and I could see that they pretty much thought it was. "Liza," said Mr. Turner softly, "I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you why you and your friend were, partly undressed." At this point, my usually quiet mother jumped to her feet and said, "Oh, for Lord's sake! My daughter has already told her father and me that there was nothing untoward going on. Liza is an honest girl, a painfully honest girl. She has never lied to us in her life. Don't you know how teenage girls are? They're always washing each other's hair and trying on each other's clothes, things like that. There could be a million reasons why they weren't quite dressed, a million reasons." "Teenage girls," shouted Mrs. Poindexter, moving around to our side of the table and walking toward my mother, "do not usually try on lumberjackets, and I've never felt that your Liza had any particular interest in her hair. As a matter of fact, I have often felt that your daughter Eliza—" "Yes?" shouted my mother. She looked about ready to swing at Mrs. Poindexter. Dad reached out and grabbed her arm, but she ignored him. "Ladies, ladies," said Mr. Turner, standing up, "that will do. I realize how emotionally charged this is. I warned you, Mrs. Poindexter, what might happen if we handled this matter in this way. In any case, we absolutely cannot tolerate this kind of behavior from anyone." Everyone sat down again, fuming, Mrs. Poindexter included, and I was still left with the question. "Liza," said Mrs. Poindexter, a little sulkily, "answer the question. Why were you and that other girl so incompletely dressed?" I looked at Dad and then at Mr. Turner. I don't know where it came from, but I said, "I guess this is where I say that I don't want to answer without a lawyer." "May I point out," said Mrs. Poindexter coldly, "that that statement in itself can be interpreted as an admission of guilt?" Mr. Turner cleared his throat angrily, but before he could say anything, the red-haired woman threw her pencil down. "I think this is all perfectly absurd," she said, "not to mention very, very cruel and downright twisted. What this young woman does on her own time with her own friends is her business, and her parents' business, not ours. I must say I might be concerned if I were her parents, but as trustee of this school, I have more serious things to worry about." She looked at Mrs. Poindexter, and her voice dropped a little. "Frankly, Mrs. Poindexter, this near vendetta reminds me of another incident a few years back, the one involving the boy and girl in the senior class. You will all recall it, I'm sure. Perhaps there was some small point in the school's involvement in that sense. Because of the girl's condition, the students would naturally become aware of the situation. But I see no chance of that here, or of this incident getting to the public as you seem to fear it might, and damaging the fundraising campaign. In fact, I see much more danger of its being publicized as a result of this ridiculously anachronistic hearing than because of the incident itself. The overriding point, she said, looking around at the board members and then at Miss Baxter and Mrs. Poindexter, fundraising campaign or no fundraising campaign, is whether Liza's conduct affected the other students adversely, or whether something wrong was done on school time or on school grounds. Obviously, the latter doesn't apply, and as to the former, it is certainly unfortunate that Sally Cheryl may have been exposed to something that disturbed her, but she is no more a child than Liza is, and it's clear to me that Liza did not willingly make Sally a party to her behavior. Most people nowadays are fairly enlightened about homosexuality, and there certainly was no purposeful wrong here, no attempt to— "There are the teachers," said Mrs. Poindexter softly. "There is the question of influence, the decided influence that teachers have over students. That is a separate issue," said the red-haired woman angrily, "and obviously one of much greater relevance." Mr. Turner said, "I think we should ascertain if Liza wishes to say anything further to us, and then, bearing in mind that she has requested counsel and that her presence here is voluntary, move to the matter of the two teachers. We can call Liza at a future date, I am sure, if need be, assuming she is willing to be questioned further." Mrs. Poindexter's lips tightened, and she twisted her glasses chain angrily. "I agree," said the red-haired woman, "and I apologize for my outburst, Mr. Turner, but this has all seemed to me so terribly unnecessary that I couldn't help speaking out. I simply don't see that what the two girls did or didn't do is of any importance whatsoever. What matters is the influence the teachers may or may not have had on them and on other foster students." I think I must have been staring at her, because I remember she gave me a sort of embarrassed and apologetic smile. "It is important," I wanted to shout. It was as if she'd suddenly betrayed me, the one person on the board I'd really trusted and who I thought had understood. I knew she was trying to be fair to everyone, not just to me, but, oh God, I wanted to stand up and shout. No one had any influence on us. Miss Stevenson and Miss Woodmere had nothing to do with it. What we did on our own. We love each other. Can't anyone understand that? Please, can't someone? We love each other, just us, by ourselves. But although most of those words were in my mind by the time Mr. Turner looked at me again and said, "Liza, is there anything else you would like to say?" all I could do was shake my head and whisper, "No, sir." And much, much later, I thought of what Annie had said about mountains and felt as if I still had a whole range of them left to climb. Chapter 17. I remember very little about the next few days. I know I saw Annie only twice, and both times we were stiff and silent with each other, as if all the fears, all the barriers were back between us. The long, thin white envelope came on Saturday when Chad and I were home watching a Mets game. Chad went down for the mail during a commercial. I was sitting there, idly wondering if they were ever going to rewrite the stupid beer ad I was suffering through for the millionth time, when I heard his key scraping in the lock, and then his voice saying, "Liza, I think it's come." He handed me the envelope, from Foster, and I swear he was more scared than I was. He hadn't said much about what it had been like at school for the past couple of weeks while I hadn't been there, but I got the impression it hadn't been any picnic for him. Sally, he'd mentioned casually, wouldn't speak to him. Even though she was a senior and he was only a sophomore, they'd always been friendly enough to say hi in the halls and things like that. Sweet, wonderful Chad. One afternoon he came home late with a bloody nose and blood in his sheepdog hair. He ran straight to Dad. He wouldn't speak to me. Neither he nor Dad ever told me what happened, but I'm pretty sure I know, and it still makes me sick thinking about it. "Aren't you going to open it? You want me to go away? I'll go back to the game," he said, and turned toward the TV set. It's funny, but I didn't feel much of anything, staring at that envelope before I opened it. Maybe it was because by then I really didn't want to go back to Foster anyway, even if they said I could. And so in a way, I was dreading not being expelled as much as being expelled. The only thing I was conscious of worrying about was MIT, and whether the trustees would notify me if they expelled me and what reason they'd give. There was a roar from the TV set. The Mets had just gotten a run. Chad didn't roar, though, and you can usually hear his shouts halfway down the hall outside our apartment. I stuck my finger under the flap of the envelope, and it opened so easily I hoped it hadn't come unglued on the way and that the letter hadn't fallen out in front of everyone in the post office. Dear Ms. Winthrop, the Board of Trustees of Foster Academy is happy to inform you. Chad, I said, it's okay. Chad threw his arms around me and shouted, hooray! Then he stepped back, and I must have looked pale or something, because he sort of eased me down into Dad's chair and said, Hey, Liza, you want some water or an aspirin or something? I shook my head, but he got me some water anyway, and after I drunk some of it, he said, Aren't you going to read the rest of the letter? You read it, I said. Sure? I nodded. So Chad read out loud. Dear Ms. Winthrop, the Board of Trustees of Foster Academy is happy to inform you that, after due deliberation relative to the disciplinary hearing held on April 27th of this year, we have found no cause for action of any kind in your case, disciplinary or otherwise. Mrs. Poindexter has agreed that you will continue in your position of Student Council President. No account of the hearing will appear on your record, and none will be sent to any college to which you have applied or at which you have been accepted. With all good wishes for the future, sincerely, John Turner, Chairman. There's a separate little slip, too, Chad said, holding it up, saying that you can go back to school on Monday. I can't wait, I said dryly. Lies? He looked very puzzled. Liza, doesn't mean, doesn't mean you weren't, but I thought, Oh, God, Chad, was all I said, all I could say, and then I went out of the room to call Annie, leaving my poor little brother even more bewildered than before. After I called Annie, I tried several times to call Miss Stevenson and Miss Woodmere, but wasn't able to reach them. I tried again on Sunday, and Annie and I even talked about walking over there, but Annie pointed out that it might be more sensible not to let anyone, especially Miss Baxter, see us there, at least until everything had died down a bit. Monday was the first really hot day we'd had, almost like summer, but I knew that wasn't why I was sweating by the time Chad and I arrived at school. I wanted to walk in confidently, looking as if nothing had happened, but as we went up the steps, I knew I wouldn't be able to do it. If you want us to go in separately, it's okay with me, I told him. Are you crazy? He said. And then he actually held the door open for me and stared hard at a couple of sophomores who sort of snickered. Good luck, sis, he whispered. Yell if you need me. I've got a left jab that packs quite a wallop. I suppose I embarrassed him by doing it, but I hugged him right there in the hall. Foster felt like a place I'd never been before when I walked through the hall that day and downstairs to my locker. I guess it was mostly that I didn't feel I could trust people there anymore, and somehow that made even the familiar shabby walls look potentially hostile. There were the same rooms, the same people, the same staircases, the same dark wood and stuffy smell, the same dining room with little vases of violets from the school garden on each table, the same bulletin board on which Sally had put her ear-piercing sign 100 years ago, my same old battered locker. Would there be another note? There wasn't. A couple of kids came to their lockers when I was putting stuff back into mine, and I said hi, and they said hi back, but of course it was a little stiff and embarrassed on both sides. Valerie Crabb, who was in my physics class, tried, though. She held out her hand to me and said, Welcome back, Liza. You want any help making up stuff in physics? Say the word. That was really nice. But then I went into the girls' room, and that wasn't so nice. No one said anything specific, but one kid said hi loudly, like a warning. Hi, Liza! And she and another girl who'd been combing their hair left immediately, and someone who'd just gone into a booth flushed right away and hurried out without even washing her hands or looking at me. I told myself it would be great to have the John to myself every time I wanted to use it, but I didn't convince myself. Then, on the way to chemistry, I ran into Walt. He stopped right in the middle of the hall when I was still a few feet away and held out his hand to me. "Liza, hello," he said, all smiles. "Hey, it's really good to see you back. I mean that. Really good." I tried to shift my books around so I could shake his hand, since he was holding it out so persistently. "Hi, Walt," I said, and started walking again as soon as the handshake was over. He fell into step beside me. "Hey, listen, Liza," he said. "I hope you're not going to let any of this, well, affect you at all. I mean, well, sure, Sally was upset, but I want you to know I'm behind you all the way. I can understand Sally's reaction, but, well, I'm not going to desert a friend just because of a little sex problem or anything. I mean, the way I figure it, it's just like any other handicap." Luckily, we just about reached the lab by then, and luckily Waltz's first period class was Latin, not chem. I didn't really notice in chemistry that the only people sitting near me were boys, especially since, when we broke to do an experiment, my lab partner, who was a very intense, brilliant girl named Zelda, who was going to be a doctor and who hardly ever smiled, began asking me questions. She started innocently enough, saying, "Welcome back, Liza. I mean that sincerely." I thanked her, trying not to make as big a thing of it as she was, and started trying to figure out how many pages to skip in my lab notebook to allow for experiments I'd missed and would have to make up. Zelda was setting out apparatus, not looking at me, but then she said in an odd, sort of choked voice, "If you'd like to talk about it any time, Liza, I'll be glad to listen." I looked up then, and when I saw her face, the icicles started coming back to my stomach. "Thanks," I said carefully, "but I don't think so." Her face seemed very serious, but her eyes didn't. "Liza, may I ask you something?" "Sure," I said reluctantly. "Well, I think you know me well enough to know this isn't out of any prurient interest or anything, right?" The icicles on my stomach got colder. I shrugged, feeling trapped. "Well," Zelda began, "since I'm going to be a doctor and all." It was at this point that I realized there were several other kids, mostly girls, but a few boys too, clustered around our table, as if they were all suddenly coming over to borrow a test tube or ask a question. But there were too many of them for that. Zelda went right on talking as if they weren't there, but I could see she was very aware of them. "I just wondered," she said smoothly, "if you could tell me, from a scientific standpoint, of course, just what it is that two girls do in bed." It did get better, although it took a while for some of the girls to sit next to me again in class. That was funny, in a way. At Foster, we didn't have assigned seats, and as I said, I really didn't notice it in chemistry that first morning, but by afternoon it had become pretty obvious. When I realized what was going on, I purposely arrived a little late to my classes so I'd get to choose who to sit next to, and could maybe show the girls that I wasn't going to rape them in the middle of math or something. I don't know, I'm probably exaggerating, but it did seem a little grim at first. I guess if I add it all up, though, I'd have to say that for every kid who was rotten, and there were really only a few, there were at least two, like Valerie and all the kids who just said hi to me in an ordinary, friendly way, who counteracted it. Mary Lou Dibbins, for instance, came up to me and said, "Thank God you're back. Angela can't even begin to stand up and to Mrs. Poindexter at council meetings." There was a girl in history class who just smiled, came over to me, and, as if nothing had happened, asked if I had an extra pen. And then there was Con and what he told me. It was later in the afternoon of that first day before I got around to reading the bulletin board in the main hall. A notice had gone up, dated noon, from Mrs. Poindexter, canceling the next two council meetings, which meant that, despite what Mary Lou had said, there'd probably only be one more I'd preside at, since finals were coming up soon. Seeing that notice was like having the last bad thing happen on one of those days when everything goes wrong. Con came up to me when I was standing there, and he obviously figured out what I was going through, which made it partly worse and partly better. "Life," he observed, looking at the bulletin board instead of at me, "is a crock of you-know-what, with all the wrong people falling into it. Still, you hear about Poindexter?" "No," I said through the damp haze in front of my eyes. "What about her?" "Leaving at the end of the year. Some order from the Board of Trustees. It's not around school yet, but there was this official-looking letter in the office that I just happened to see Baxter weeping over. something about frequent demonstrations of poor judgment and overreaction to trivial incidents, and continuous overextension of authority to the point of undermining democratic principles. Also, you might like to know that Friday afternoon, Mr. Piccolo announced that the pledges are really starting to come in now. Con put his hand on my arm, still looking at the bulletin board. "Liza," he said, "listen, MIT's going to be great. You know that, don't you?" I managed a nod, and Con patted my arm and said, "Don't forget it." And then he even had the tact to go away, and I still stood there. Right at that moment, it didn't matter to me very much how good it was that Mrs. Poindexter was leaving. It did matter that it was obvious she'd been kicked out by the Board of Trustees, and that even though the disciplinary hearing was clearly not the only reason, it certainly must have been one of the reasons. The trouble was, all I could think was I did that too, because right then I didn't want to have an effect on anyone's life, not even Mrs. Poindexter's. I just wanted to be as anonymous and unimportant as the newest freshman, from then till graduation. But I decided, since this was my first and only free period that day, to go ahead with what I'd been on my way to do when I'd stopped at the bulletin board. Go to the art studio to see Miss Stevenson and find out how Miss Woodmere's and her hearing had gone. I didn't have English till last period, so I hadn't seen Miss Woodmere yet. But there was a strange woman rummaging in Miss Stevenson's supply cupboards. She looked up blankly when I went in and said, "Yes, may I help you? I don't think there's a class here this period, is there?" The woman laughed in a friendly way as she went to Mrs. Stevenson's drawing board and picked up a schedule. I wonder how long it's going to take me to learn that what's when. Is anything the matter? Miss Stevenson's got another cold, I told myself as I ran out. She's just absent. I think I ran all the way to Miss Woodmere's room. There was a class going on, but Sally was right outside the closed door, at the water fountain. "If you're looking for Miss Woodmere," Sally said with a little smile, "I'm afraid you won't find her here." "But she should be back today," I said, still stupidly bewildered, "the way I am. I mean, I got my notice Saturday, so she must have." "I'm sure she got hers Saturday too, Liza," Sally said, almost sympathetically. "That's why she's not here." I think I said, "Oh, God," and started to walk away. But Sally came after me. "Liza," she said, "listen. You may not believe me, but, well, I'm sorry I had to do what I did. I'm sorry I was mad too, and, well, I'd like to help you, Liza. Walt knows of this really good doctor, a shrink, I mean." I tried to brush her away, and I probably said something terse like, "I don't need your help," but she hung on. All I could think of was getting to a phone and calling Miss Stevenson and Miss Woodmere. "Listen, Liza, the trustees had to do it, don't you see? Even if there hadn't been a fundraising campaign going on, they'd have had to fire Miss Stevenson and Miss Woodmere. Having teachers like that, it's sort of like my causing ear infections, isn't it? Only this is so very much worse. I mean, it just ruins people for getting married and having kids and having a normal, healthy sex life. And for just plain being happy and well-adjusted. The thing is, well, think of the influence teachers have." She smiled sadly. "Oh, Liza, think of yourself. Think of how influenced you were by them. You always liked Miss Stevenson especially. You almost idolize her." I swear it was all I could do not to shake her. "I do not idolize her," I shouted. "I like them both, the way most other kids in this school do. I didn't even know they were. I didn't." I sputtered for a few seconds more, thinking it might still be risky to say outright that they were gay. Instead, I said, "Sally, I'd have been gay anyway. Can't you understand that? I was gay before I knew anything about them." Then I heard myself saying, "I was probably always gay. You know I never liked boys that way." "Gay," Sally said softly. "Oh, Liza, what a sad word. What a terribly sad word. Miss Baxter said that to me, and she's right. Even with drugs and liquor and other problems like that, most of the words are more honestly negative. Stoned, drunk out of one's mind." I think it was at that point that I did take hold of Sally's arm, not to shake her, but just to shut her up. I remember trying to keep my voice from breaking. "It's not a problem," I said. "It's not negative. Don't you know that it's love you're talking about? You're talking about how I feel about another human being and how she feels about me, not about some kind of disease you have to save us from." Sally shook her head. No, Liza, it isn't love. It's immature, like a crush, or a sort of mental problem, or maybe you're just scared of boys. I was too, sort of, before I knew Walt. She smiled, almost shyly. I really was, Liza, even if that sounds funny. But he's so understanding and well, maybe you'll meet a boy like him someday and oh, Liza, don't you want to be ready for that when it happens? A shrink could help you, Liza, I'm sure. Why, they said at the hearing that. I stared at her. Were you at the hearing? Why, yes, she said, looking surprised. At Miss Stevenson's and Miss Woodmare's. I thought you knew. I came in just as you and your parents were leaving. I was going to speak at your part, too, but then they thought I shouldn't, since I'm in your class and we've been friends and all, and I agreed. But Mrs. Poindexter wanted me to talk about what kind of influence Miss Stevenson and Miss Woodmere had on the students, on you especially. And you said, well, I had to tell the truth, didn't I? I told them that you idolize them, because it's true, Liza. I don't care what you say. You certainly idolize Miss Stevenson. And I said that maybe you thought that anything they did was fine, and that you sort of, well, want to be like them and all. Oh, God, I said, running through my head. It's snowing, Annie, Liza wrote. But the echo of Sally's words and of her own stalled thoughts interrupted. Running through my head was, what? She wrote again, groping. The snow here on the campus is so white, so pure. Once when I was little, did I ever tell you this? I saw a magazine picture of a terrible black and twisted shape, a little like an old-fashioned steam radiator, but with a head on it and stubby feet with claws. Someone, maybe my mother, said jokingly, see, that's what you look like inside when you're bad. I never forgot it, and that's what I felt like inside since last spring. Running through my head now is, Annie, if I'd been at their part of the hearing, I could have told the truth. I probably could have saved them. Well, maybe saved them, if I'd been there. And even at my own hearing, I might have been able to help them. I could have said, I wanted to say, that they'd had no influence, that I'd have been gay anyway. Liza put on her jacket. She went outside and stood on the deserted riverbank, watching the snow fall lazily into the Charles. If I hadn't been gay, she thought, as her mind cleared, if nothing had happened in that house, in that bedroom. But damn it, she said aloud, you are gay, Liza, and something did happen in that house, and it happened because you love Annie in ways you wouldn't if you weren't gay. Liza Winthrop, you are gay. Go on from that, Liza, she told herself, walking now. Climb that last mountain. Chapter 18. It comes back in clouds, in wispy images. I remember walking with Annie to Cobble Hill late in the afternoon of that first day back at school, the day Sally told me Miss Stevenson and Miss Woodmere had been fired. It was raining again. I remember that too, and there was no one at home in the little house with the gardens front and back. I remember Annie looking up at the doorway, saying, I can't hate it, Liza. Can you? I didn't understand what she meant, so I asked her, and she said, I've been afraid that I'd hate this house, but I can't. I love it. So much of what happened here was beautiful. And Annie kissed me then, in the rain, in the dark doorway. The front door was open when we went back on Saturday, and there were cardboard boxes all around and suitcases, and Miss Stevenson's masterpiece from the art studio was propped up in a corner, and the cats were in carrying cases so they wouldn't run outside in the confusion and get lost. The little house in Cobble Hill was being stripped of all the things that made it look warm and loved and lived in. Miss Woodmere was out in the back garden, digging up a plant and obviously trying to look braver than she felt. Miss Stevenson, in a pair of old jeans, was packing the last of their books. Hi, you two, she said. She even smiled when we came in. What I did then was something I'll never regret. I hugged her. We held each other for a very long minute, and then she pushed me away, smiling, and said, "Oh, look, it's not so bad. We're lucky. We have this place in the country. We were going to retire there anyway. I've been talking about doing some serious painting, and Ka, well, she's always wanted to have a big vegetable garden and some chickens, and to write poetry of her own instead of reading other people's. Now we can—" "You're teachers," I remember saying. "You're such good teachers, good for kids." "Well, we've had more than 20 years of that. Lots of people change careers these days." But I looked at Annie, and Annie looked at me, and we both knew that what really mattered was that probably neither of those two brave and wonderful women would ever teach again. "Annie, today I went outside, and in the snow in the courtyard outside my dorm, I built a replica of my childhood monster and wished you were with me. My snow monster was pure and white and guiltless, and I looked at it, Annie, and it struck me that it can never turn black and ugly like the monster of my childhood, because what is guiltless about it is what it is, not necessarily what it does. Even if sometimes what it does is bad or cowardly or foolish, it itself is still okay, not evil. It can be good and brave and wise as long as it goes on trying." And then, Annie, I tore the monster down and wished again that you were with me. Annie and I went out that last Saturday to get lunch for all of us, roast beef sandwiches and Cokes. It was so much like an indoor picnic, among the boxes and the suitcases, that we all tried to be cheerful, but that only worked a little. "I hope everyone likes roast beef," Annie said. Miss Stevenson bit into her sandwich. "Super." She waved her sandwich at us. "Eat up, you two. Oh, do stop looking like a couple of frightened rabbits. It'll be okay. There are a lot of unfair things in this world, and gay people certainly come in for their share of them. But so do lots of other people. And besides, it doesn't really matter. What matters is the truth of loving, of two people finding each other. That's what's important, and don't you forget it." Annie smiled at me, and I felt her hand squeeze mine, and I think we both realized at the same time what a comfortable feeling it was to be able to sit there with other people like us, holding hands. But even so, I still felt crummy inside. I know you're trying to make us feel better," I said, "but to think of you not being allowed to teach." Miss Woodmere stuffed a used napkin into a paper bag. "We should tell them, Isabel," she said, "about when we were kids." "When we were kids," said Miss Stevenson, nodding, "and our parents found out about us. Well, suspected. They told us we could never see each other again." "God!" said Annie. "Yes. Well, of course we did anyway," said Miss Woodmere. "We did a lot of sneaking around," said Miss Stevenson, "for more than a year. It was rather horrible, and we got caught a few times. Once almost the way you two did, as Ka very rightly reminded me when I was too angry to remind myself." "So we know what that feels like," said Miss Woodmere softly. "How dirty it makes you feel at a time when you want to feel wonderful, and do feel wonderful, new and pure and full of love, full of life." Miss Stevenson got up and went to the window. Then she stooped and touched the orange cat's nose affectionately through the grating in his carrying case. "Look," she said quietly, "I can't lie to you and say that losing our jobs like this is easy. It isn't. But the point is that it'll be okay. We'll be okay, and we want to know that you will be too." Miss Woodmere leaned forward. "Isabel was a WAC for a while," she said, "between high school and college. Someone found some of my letters to her. Talk about inquisitions. The Army's a good deal better at them than Foster, I can assure you. But you know what? Even though Isabel was discharged, and even though it looked for a time as if no college would take her, one finally did. And after a while, once she'd gotten her first teaching job and held on to it for more than a year, it hardly mattered any more. Not in a practical way, anyhow. And Miss Woodmere smiled lovingly at Miss Stevenson. The important thing is, she said, that we got through that time too, and we're still together. Miss Stevenson patted Miss Woodmere's hand, and then she came over to me and put her hands on my shoulders. I should also tell you, she glanced at Miss Woodmere, who nodded, that Ka almost left me after my discharge. She went through more hell than I did, Liza, because she blamed herself for writing those letters to me, even though I was the one who left them around. She kept thinking that if she hadn't written them, if I hadn't been gay, said Miss Woodmere softly, then nothing would have happened. No court-martial, no discharge. It took me a couple of years to realize, said Miss Woodmere, that it wasn't my fault, that it wasn't my homosexuality that had gotten Isabel discharged. It was what people wrongly made of it. Annie's hand tightened in mine, and she whispered, "See?" I think, said Miss Woodmere, that I had to accept I was gay before I could realize that it wasn't my fault about the discharge. She chuckled. That's why I like that quote so much, the one about the truth making one free. It does, you know, whatever that truth is. Miss Stevenson, I know she said something then, but I can't quite remember the words. I think I said something lame about their teaching jobs again. And I can sort of remember the way Miss Stevenson looked at me, as if she were trying to get inside my mind. She put her hands on my shoulders again, still looking at me the same way, looking right into me, and she said, Miss Stevenson said, Liza, forget about our jobs. Forget that for now. This is the thing to remember. The very worst thing for Ka and me would be to be separated from each other, or to be so worn down, so guilt-ridden and torn apart that we couldn't stay together. Anything else is just bad, said Miss Woodmere, but no worse than bad. Bad things can always be overcome. You did nothing to us, Miss Stevenson said gently. If you two remember nothing else from all this, Miss Woodmere said, remember that. Please, don't punish yourselves for people's ignorant reactions to what we all are. Don't let ignorance win, said Miss Stevenson. Let love. Liza pushed back her chair, her eyes going from the last part of her long, fragmentary letter up to Annie's picture, remembering as the snow fell outside her window how the snow had fallen on the promenade nearly a year earlier when they'd given each other the rings. She looked at her watch. It was only 6 o'clock in California. Dinner time. I'm not going to think about it, she said to herself, getting up. I've thought enough already. I'm just going to go ahead and do it. She found Annie's first letter from Berkeley and copied down the phone number of her dorm. She counted out all the change she had and borrowed 4 quarters from the girl across the hall. By the time she got to the phone booth on the first floor of her dorm, her mouth was dry and her heart was racing. She had to say, Annie Kenyon, twice to the woman, operator, student, who answered impersonally at the other end. And then there was Annie's voice from thousands of miles away, saying with mild curiosity, Hello? Liza closed her eyes. Annie, she said. Annie, it's Liza. A pause. Then, Liza? Liza, oh my God, is it really you? Liza, where are you? Yes, it's me. I'm at MIT. Annie, I'm sorry I haven't written. Liza heard herself laugh. Oh, God, what a dumb thing to say. Annie, are you coming home for Christmas? A laugh, a slow, rich, full of delight laugh. Of course I am. Liza, I don't believe this. This guy I know, he's from Boston, and there's someone in New York he wants to see. He just offered to switch plane tickets with me. I told him about us, a bit. He offered to switch plane tickets if I wanted to, well, try to see you. I said I didn't know. I'd have to think about it. Our vacation starts tomorrow. I was trying to work up the courage to call you. Liza, are you still there? Yes. Annie, sorry. I I'm crying. It's so good to hear your voice again. I know, I'm crying too. Switch tickets, please. We can go home together. My vacation doesn't start for a couple of days. I'll meet you at Logan Airport. Just give me the flight number. Annie? Yes? Annie, Miss Woodmere was right. Remember about the truth making one free? Annie, I'm free now. I love you. I love you so much. And in a near whisper, I love you too, Liza. Oh, God, I love you too.